Okay, welcome to this discussion of critical analysis as part of the continuing professional development programme here at the University of Glasgow. This CPD session will focus on the skills of critical analysis using a short prose extract as an exemplar. I will go over the content of the presentation imminently, but I should just state at the outset that I'm not a teaching specialist myself, although I'll be touching on the criteria which shape the SQA Higher's English module critical reading skills. This session will not be an in-depth guide to the assessment framework. Rather, I'll be using it as a bridge to explore some of the teaching strategies we adopt with our first years and maybe identify some common pedagogical ground between Highers, advanced Highers, maybe A-level IB if you're outside of Scotland, and first year university teaching of literary texts. Now, I've used some of our students as guinea pigs, so I'll be giving you a sense of how our first years, new to their degree, respond to some of the teaching strategies I'll be discussing at key points, particularly in relation to prompts, which tend to recur throughout SQA specifications. So this session, will engage with the skills required to construct a critical essay. It will explore the ways in which students are able to apply their understanding, analysis and evaluation skills to a prose text. Topics I am going to address include how to approach the question, how to select relevant textual examples, and how to discuss and explain ideas. This presentation won't be focusing on close reading skills per se. That was the subject of the previous CPD session. Rather, the emphasis will be on how to organize material into the shape of a response. So here is the SQA Higher's English specification for critical reading skills. This is a truncated version. If you've looked at the specification, it goes on for pages and pages, but I think it gives a clear sense of the task students are required to complete. There are two sections to critical reading skills, part B, a series of short questions. The first steer is this word analysis. SQA love the word analysis. It crops up throughout all of their modules. And the second steer are these two in bold at the bottom here, discuss how and explain how. So I'm going to be discussing a prose extract from The Learning by Andrew Michael Hurley. It's an absolutely unbelievable book. I definitely would urge you to read it. It's an astonishing contemporary folk horror novel. And I'll be focusing on the following three skills, which are a crucial feature of the critical analysis of texts. These are understanding the question, integrating evidence, and analysing meaning. The first part of this presentation, the first 10-12 minutes or so, will focus on a question formation which appears on the reading critical skills paper. And the question formation SQA tend to use is analyse how the writer uses language to ... So I'll spend about 10 minutes thinking about that. And then part two will focus on a second question formation, which also appears on the reading critical skills paper. By referring to the extract, discuss or explain how ... Now I'll blend understanding the question, integrating evidence and analysing meaning as part of my approach to both of these question formations, both of these areas of critical analysis. Here is the extract from The Learning. Now, I'm going to be referring to it at key points. I've given this my students to read, and I'll read it out now, just so everybody's got an understanding of some of the teaching strategies I'm going to go on to discuss. And also, it's really spooky and amazing. But it was impossible to truly know the Learning. It changed with each influx and retreat of water, and the neap tides would reveal the skeletons of those who thought they had read the place well enough to escape its insidious currents. There were animals, people sometimes, the remains of both at once, a drover and his sheep cut off and drowned on the old crossing from Cumbria. And now, since their death for a century or more, the Lerne had been pushing their bones back inland as if it were proving a point. No one with any knowledge of the place ever went near the water. No one apart from us and Billy Tapper, that is. Here is the first question formation. Analyze how the writer uses language to ... I've chosen the phrase create an unsettling atmosphere as it's very relevant to the extract, as you can see, and it's quite rich, I think, and interesting in relation to the textual evidence that the students will have to work with. Now, this is the one slide which touches briefly on some of the ideas I discussed last week. I have found out there are only so many ways you can critically define the word analysis. Analysis can be broadly defined as the critical exploration of literary effects, why certain words, images, and metaphors are able to generate meaning, and how those meanings are achieved on the page. So analysis, as I understand it, and I think as SQA understands it, is centered on textual evidence. It's impossible to have a sense of meaning without a textual source in play. And conversely, it's impossible, I think, to identify a really amazing piece of language without an understanding of the effects that that language can emit. Effect and evidence seem to be fused together in relation to critical analysis. However, this tends to be a really difficult concept for students to grasp when they're faced with the challenge of critical analysis, as I'm sure everybody watching this knows from our own teaching practice of literature. Quite a lot of students either tend to identify really cogent pieces of evidence without considering why they're relevant, or they identify a really subtle reading without always tracing it back to a textual source. And that's one aspect of critical analysis that I'm really keen to engage with fairly early on with our first year students. So here are some strategies we adopt in first year when exploring analytical effect in prose. Again, just a really quick caveat, I'm not a teaching specialist. I don't have professional expertise in SQA critical reading skills. The aim is just to see if there are any overlaps between the two fields of school pedagogy and entry-level higher education study of literature. So the steer in the question is unsettling atmosphere. So this will shape the teaching response in relation to the task, which is critical analysis. One thing I always ask the students to do is focus their attention on the very first line, almost viewing it as a code text embedded with the analytical material, which will be useful later. In other words, the first line as meaning in embryo. Now, the first line of the extract is this: but it was impossible to truly know the Lerne. The first line is really interesting, I think, especially in relation to an unsettling atmosphere. Beginning with a conjunction in the word but establishes a degree of past connections, which the reader does not have access to. It invokes a history which is murky and unknowable. Even further, that opening line presupposes a past. So I would be saying to my students, we know the influence of that which has gone before seems to be a significant feature of how the atmosphere is being constructed or fashioned in this extract. Now, you might have a different reading of how that line operates. I would absolutely encourage my students to have divergent readings from my own, but hopefully it gives you a sense of how an analysis of the opening line can establish some of the thematic parameters which help to foster and generate critical analysis. So that's just one strategy I tend to do in seminars. And another strategy is to ask students to focus on the voice. And I always ask the question, who is the speaker? The fact that any voice in prose is essentially disembodied is itself quite unsettling, so that can give us a head start. What is the narrator withholding? What do they know? I always make the critical assumption that the voice in a novel has access to a reality which the reader can only partially glimpse. And I think this can be really productive when asking students to critically analyse literary effects, to not necessarily think that the narrator, a first-person narrator, is a real person with thoughts and feelings. So I would ask, how is this voice used to create an unsettling atmosphere? Well, in the extract, the speaker knows more than us. They have access to a history, as we've established from the first line, which we as readers can only glimpse through their disclosures. And this in itself places the reader at a disadvantage, at the mercy of the voice who is guiding us through this murky terrain. And I guess it doesn't help in the learning that the information we are given tends to focus on death, corpses, and the sucking malevolence of the water. So that's the second strategy. Next, I would say to the students that the voice we are engaging with, the represented mind, be it in the first or third person, depending on what the extract is fundamentally comprised of language. It's textured and imbricated with metaphors and linguistic effects. And I think asking the students to see metaphors, to see literary language as patterns which are woven throughout language is a good way of bringing evidence to bear on the readings which have been activated either by the first line or by the material that the voice is choosing to disclose to the reader. It's a way of bringing a more abstract reading of the text in direct dialogue with specific pieces of evidence as those words and metaphors are tracked. In order to convert this material into critical analysis, I then ask students, either in pairs or in small groups, to place their analysis in a grammatical structure built around analytical verbs. There are a few here on the slide: suggests, reveals, shows, implied. I'm sure everybody's familiar with them as part of teaching practice. I think students seem to think this type of thing is a bit dry, so I always try and be trendy tutor to silence in the room. I always say something like analytical verbs are like catalysts. They're the literary equivalent of catalysts in chemistry. They turn evidence into effect, and they can transform personal reflections into objective analytical concepts, and they should be integrated into critical analysis as routine practice. So they're just some strategies I do to try and bring evidence and effect into a really, really tight dialogue with each other as part of critical analysis. I asked my students to engage with some of these ideas and find any pieces of evidence they thought were interesting, especially in relation to an unsettling atmosphere. And these are the images that they highlighted. Straight up skeletons, obviously, like Gothic literature. Escape its insidious currents, remains of both at once. Sheep cut off and drowned, pushing their bones back inland. Not very cheery, is it? So I asked them to do that, and then I after we explored the strategies in the seminar, I asked them the question: analyze how the writer uses language to create an unsettling atmosphere. And they came up with several answers. I picked two. So answer one: the phrase "reveal the skeletons" suggests that the learner will not merely take away the lives of humans, but reveal that the death has taken place. This recurrence of death creates an unsettling atmosphere, as the dead are not remembered in a traditional sense, but transformed into a warning or a threat. I think that was a really cool answer. And you can see I've just put in bold some of the typical analytic structures, I guess, in terms of their grammar that would transform this from an opinion into what I think is a really interesting critical analysis. And then answer two, one student said, the phrase "escape its insidious currents" implies that the learner is possessed of a force of its own. The idea that the landscape is somehow active creates an unsettling atmosphere, as its actions are consistently described as malevolent and fatal, and therefore harmful to the inhabitants. So that's how I would go about engaging with that particular question formation. centered around analysis. Now, I'm going to move on to the second by referring to the extract, discuss or explain how. And the word I've used here is discuss or explain how humans interact with the landscape. I think that's a really crucial feature, I guess, of that extract from the Learn. So discuss or explain how. These are two terms which seem to be interchangeable in some sense. Obviously, they've got micro differences, but I think they're covering fairly similar ground. Both discuss and explain are evaluative words, which ask the students to consider the significance or relevance of a topic in relation to the question. The word how is asking the student to consider the role and function of linguistic effect in generating particular fields of meaning, and these fields of meaning in question will relate to the subject matter of the task. So the critical skills which are attendant on the words discuss and explain are similar to analysis. I think they do cover similar ground, although it seems to me that they are broader in scope. Discuss and explain are broader in scope. Instead of specific effects, they're asking the student to focus on how meaning is cumulatively produced across shared words, images, and metaphors. And I know that this question formation in the paper by SQA has a higher yield of marks as well. So I think they're going for a slightly more expansive answer here. There's also the corresponding sense of the significance of these accumulated meanings in relation to the themes and ideas which recur throughout the whole passage, and also the themes and ideas which are relevant to the specific wording of the question. So here are some further strategies we adopt in seminars when we're trying to move students beyond the specific analysis of words and images, and I guess start to think about how we can discuss or critically analyze their collective significance. So widening out in scope almost. The first strategy is regarding the extract as a kind of elongated conceptual metaphor. Now, there is no extended metaphor in a strict literary sense in this extract. There are no conceits as far as I can see. Rather, I'm just trying, when I say this, to encourage the students to see how a concept or a reading is produced through a slow accretion of creatively textured evidence. If you say to the students that metaphors and images, though different, can work to produce a tone or a deeper sense of meaning, then I found this is usually quite an effective way of highlighting the links between the disparate aspects of the text, between bringing different images, metaphors, and similes into a kind of critical dialogue with each other, showing how these images effectively can speak to each other. And I just think it's really nice to remind the students that metaphor itself gets to the very heart of what literature is. It captures the process of transformation, and it's used by writers, especially in prose, to delineate space and also establish the construction of interior states, such as memories, emotions, and reflections, what we tend to think of as character. So first, I would split the students into pairs and say something like, working with words, images, and metaphors as our baseline, trace how humans interact with the landscape of the learning. I would next ask them to gather their evidence together, noting any overlaps, parallels, or connections, those instances where one image or metaphor blurs or melds with another as part of the cumulative technique of producing a theme. I would then ask students to color code the words, images, or metaphors which relate to the component parts of the question. In this case, it would be people, the landscape, and how the two interact. Once this evidence is gathered, I would ask the students to extract 2 or 3 inferences or meanings from their gathered evidence, almost like super effects. I would give them a caveat. I would say the meanings must be relevant to more than one piece of evidence, so you can't narrow down on one small word. And your account of super effects must make sense in the total appreciation of the passage. In terms of academic writing skills, part of the task is to shape and harness the material the students will have gathered into a coherent critical argument with a clear sense of how a particular concept has been represented. In other words, how the presence of the topic cited in the question can be explained or discussed in relation to textual prompts. And I've often found that the following evaluative phrases are really useful when explaining this process to students. In other words, the process of explaining how. I think the word how just seems to be really, really crucial for this particular question. So there are some key phrases that students really like integrating into their work when they're beginning to think about how to discuss or explain a prompt. One, the evidence, whatever the poetic evidence is, represents, highlights, leads to, brings about. That's a good way of bringing different readings together. And then the cumulative effect of the evidence is ... or taken together the evidence ... So here is the slide. I tried to get really light purple, but PowerPoint wouldn't let me. So it might be tricky to read, but it's demonstrative more than anything else. Here's an image of metaphor tracing. Blue refers to the landscape, red refers to the people, and purple is where the two kind of extended metaphors, the textured writing in relation to the prompt, seem to mingle or meld together, and you can see there's quite a lot of purple here. I have found in my seminar teaching this is an effective way of helping students to clearly see how different sections of evidence can be almost selected and applied to specific components or parts of the question. The task of explaining or discussing how the question is operating throughout the passage tends to be made just that bit more visible. So I corralled my students. I said, okay, let's give it a go. Let's try and discuss or explain how humans and the landscape are in dialogue or a relationship with each other throughout the extract. And here are two responses. And again, in bold, you can see I've underlined words which I think are quite effective in transforming a reflection or an opinion into critical analysis. So the first one, the image of intermingled human and sheep bones in the phrase remains of both at once implies that there is no clear distinction between people and animals in the landscape of the Lone. This can also be seen in the phrase their bones, which are all pushed back on shore together by the sea. Collectively, these images show how the reader is unsettled, as every living being who enters the landscape of the Lone is potentially a walking skeleton, wow, prefiguring their own death. Then the second is this. The phrase, read the place well enough, implies that humans entering the landscape of the Lone can read it with ease, almost like a book or a text. However, this is revealed to be ironic, given the high death count and the fact that the landscape is making a point by throwing the bones upon the shore. When taken together, the images of reading and making a point show how the Lone is far too subtle and insidious to be read by people and is therefore extremely dangerous. So that's the end of the presentation. That's some approaches we would adopt in relation to this task, the focus of this CPD session, which is critical analysis. I hope you've found some of the strategies useful as part of your own teaching. As I said, the aim of this is to establish common pedagogical ground between students entering a degree for the first time and the amazing teaching being done in higher and advanced hires or IB or A level. What I'm going to do now is minimize the PowerPoint slide and stop the recording. And then if anybody has any questions, we can maybe have a Q&A session. So I'm just going